Oh, how lovely to be with you all today. I just got off a plane. So I'm going to try and take my time. I think I have an hour. Yeah. And there will probably be at moments some technical problems with this presentation, and you will see it flicker a little bit, but I'll try and fill in when it flickers. I'll try not to flicker, even though it has. And what I'd really like to talk with you about today is something that's actually really arising more fully in the world is, as you probably heard from John Kabat-Zinn this morning, that mindfulness and MBSR are spreading in many parts of the world. Certainly it's happening here in your country. And I have really dear colleagues here who I have known for many years. Pete and Lona and their center at their university. And lots of you who have taken programs through the Center for Mindfulness and with John and I and many of our colleagues. So we're in an interesting time because on one hand, we're having this interesting conversation between science and contemplative practice. And science is informing that conversation, and contemplative practice is informing that conversation. And on the other hand, there is a kind of an exponential rise in the research around mindfulness and also in people wanting to become MBSR teachers. And I happen to think, having been engaged in this process for 30 years, that it's not so simple. And it's not so easy. But nothing worth doing is simple or easy. Right? I mean, just think about those of you that have children. Is that simple or easy? Think of you people who've have relationships that have gone on for years, decades. Is it easy? Absolutely not. It takes persistence every single day to wake up and say, I'm in this again. And again, and again. Doesn't happen once when you got married or when you decided to, when that baby came out of you, if you're a woman. No, it happens over and over and over again. So that capacity to sustain requires certainly a certain kind of passion and a very deep commitment and a great deal of discipline. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about what's happening in the field around the formation of MBSR teachers. And I have spent nearly all my 30 years at the Center for Mindfulness deeply engaged in this question. What does this look like? What does this mean? So I don't know if I have to do that in Denmark, but in America I always have to say that I don't have any conflict of interest in relationship to this program. It's not actually quite true. I do have a lot of interest in it, but no conflict. So my colleagues, Rebecca Crane from the University of Bangor in Wales in the UK, and her colleague William Kuijken and Mark Williams. Willem is at Exeter University, Mark Williams is at Oxford, wrote a paper some time ago, what they called about teaching MBSR, or teaching mindfulness-based interventions is what the paper was about. And they described in a series of papers the current situation in which we find ourselves, that there's a lot of interest. There are a whole range of what are called MBIs, or mindfulness-based interventions, that have arisen over the past decade or two. So MBCT, probably lots of you know that, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. There's now mindfulness-based child birth and parenting. with our colleague Nancy Bardicke. There's mindfulness-based eating awareness training, MBEAT. There are a number of these MBIs arising, and that's a good thing. But in all cases, what Crane and Kuiken say is that this is the central risk here, is that we could lose the integrity of the whole process and the whole approach if the way we're creating or training or educating or bringing people into a teacher formation process isn't watched closely and tended to very closely. And I agree with them. There is a risk in it. And not so much of a risk that you don't take the risk, but how do you calculate the risk in a way that you attempt to meet the challenge in a particular way? And that's part of what I'm going to speak about. So they have delineated a series of what they call MB competencies. So you can see this is flickering. You caught it for a moment. And the first one, they say, is the knowledge of the curriculum. Okay, that makes a lot of sense, right? How would you walk into an MBSR classroom if you didn't know what the curriculum was really about? And you really don't know what the curriculum is really about if you took it once and you studied for a weekend. You'd actually have to really be inside that curriculum, because it's very easy to misapprehend the curriculum for what MBSR is really about, and therefore how to teach it. Because the curriculum is just on paper, and it walks you through 8 or 9 sessions. But if you only followed the numbers, if you will, you might not infuse a certain kind of life in it that only comes out of your living inside of it. Living inside of that curriculum. And any of you that teach in any capacity know that essentially if you haven't lived inside of something, it isn't yours. It isn't even true because you haven't lived inside of it. It's only an idea. And then the second competency that they speak about are relational skills, because just imagine in a room of 25 or 30 or 35 people, at least in our situation in the stress reduction clinic where MBSR originated, in any given classroom there might be some people with cancer, other people with heart disease, other people with pain conditions, other people with gastrointestinal problems, other people with all the kinds of stress that, beget all of us, like the loss of a child or a new diagnosis, or having to ask yourself the question, how am I going to live with what I've got for the next 30 years? And you have people in very different circumstances who may not have ever sat across the room from somebody who says, I have AIDS. Or I have an illness where my doctors tell me I probably won't live beyond the next 3 months. So what winds up happening is you have to actually be able to be in relationship to all of those people, and actually as well support them in learning to be in relationship both to themselves and to each other. That's an interesting kind of dynamic. And of course you have to be very well schooled, if you will, in guiding the mindfulness meditation practices. All of the various practices, the body scan, or sitting meditation, or yoga, or walking meditation, or all the varieties of things or methods we would describe as meditation practices. Now, I've certainly heard that some people have told me who have been MBSR students that their teachers read the meditations off of a paper. So what do you think is being transmitted there? Grammar? Not necessarily the real life of it, because you have to live inside it. You have to practice for years to have a skill in being able to guide those practices, because everything about that comes out of your own practice. Doesn't come from the book, it doesn't come from the paper, it doesn't come from annotation and commentary about these things. While those are all important, it comes out of your own lived experience, because in many ways when you're guiding a meditation in MBSR classroom, it's your meditation. And you're simply voicing it in a way that allows other people to begin to make those discoveries for themselves and about themselves. And there's a lot of teaching themes that take place in an MBSR classroom, and they involve, there's content and there's process. There's the back and forth that takes place as you are actually speaking about or conveying that content. It's not as simple as, well, I touched all the key points and now the class is over. But how do you in some way infuse them with life, with energy, with a certain kind of passion and a certain precision and understanding that would actually allow other people to begin understanding and living into and exploring and experiencing this for themselves? Because for it to be alive, for them, it has to be embodied in some way. And then how do you hold the container or the group context of the teaching? Because it's not such a, it's not like teaching grammar. So interestingly, think about it. The topic of an MBSR class is, guess what? It's me. Whoever me is, right? You're actually in that class and you're beginning to study about yourself. You're actually studying yourself. You're learning about your body. You're learning about the mind that you call my mind. You're learning about that interaction between what we call mind and what we call body. You're learning about habits, patterns, conditioning. They're all about your life. And it gets really interesting for people to be engaged with other adults in that kind of dynamic. It doesn't happen that often. To actually be learners, to be curious, to be wondering, what is this all about? And so for the instructor to be able to somehow hold all of that foment and that turbulence, because it will create turbulence for people. Whenever we look closely, what do? We discover things about ourselves. We discover things about ourselves. There's a great American baseball player who's now in his 80s, and his name is Yogi Berra. He's still alive. And we sort of commonly think of him as an American philosopher as well, because he's said some interesting things like this: when you come to a fork in the road, take it. Or he has said, you can see a lot just by looking. Yes. And of course, you can see a lot just by looking, and that's what's happening in an MBSR classroom. People are repeatedly seeing what is here to be seen, what is here to be felt, what is here to be known, tasted, touched. And that is revealing over time. So you have to learn how to hold that in some way, because guess what? That's what's happening for you as the teacher every time you move into your own life. Because the meditation practice isn't just when you're sitting there in some formal pose. That's certainly a part of it. But that kind of wondering and commitment to looking, seeing, feeling, touching, tasting is critical, and it comes out of you again. How do you do that for yourself? And of course, they say in the end that they consider this something we call embodiment as a competency. And we're having an interesting dialogue about that, because quite frankly, I'm not at all convinced that embodiment is a competency. That it may be an expression of all of those competencies that we've just looked at, but I don't think it's a competency in and of itself. And I'm going to talk a lot about that. So the American novelist Herman Melville, maybe some of you have read his books, wrote Moby Dick, among others, fantastic novelist. So he said this. So what does it mean to be embodied? You know, how do you see it? How do you feel it? How do you taste it? Could you possibly train somebody to be embodied? I don't think so. Because you can't follow the rules. There aren't any. It wasn't down on any map. True places never are. You know it when you see it, and you know it when you don't. But you can't teach somebody to be embodied. So we have an interesting challenge and riddle. So if you can't train somebody to be embodied, how do you go about the formation of teachers? Well, that's a good question, isn't it? And one we should wonder about a lot. So, in MBSR, and I want to say, let me just go back through here again. All of these competencies that I showed you, okay, they're kind of explicit. You would see those in a classroom. You would see a teacher engaging in those various dynamics that are called competencies. Problem with the word, at least as I see it, is that it's easy to teach to the competency, to the skill. It's like teaching to the test. It has some value, but it may not be all that it's cracked up to be. And yet, there are competencies that people need to, we need to be able to see those in people and assess them and wonder about them out loud with them about how it's going, because people report various issues with these various competencies when they're in the classroom all the time. And you know what? We just had an interesting training program, and this competency, conveying teaching themes. These were very seasoned MBSR teachers, 23 of them, and 15 of them said this was the competency that's the most difficult. Conveying teaching themes through both process and content, and they included in there what we call inquiry and dialogue. So these are some of these teachers have been at it for years and years, and yet that's still the most challenging place, because you're in kind of free fall in those moments. You actually have to really rely on yourself, and you have to really rely on your capacity to listen and touch and feel and kind of put your finger on the pulse of what's happening in the classroom, actually moment by moment, minute by minute, because it's changing all of the time. So those are explicit, those competencies, and I'm going to say a lot more about implicit and explicit in a little while. In fact, I'll say something about it right now. This is a lined piece of paper, but if it were blank, no lines, even with it lined, it's okay. Would you say that there's, well, maybe not an infinite, but there's a pretty large variety of ways that I could use this piece of paper, right? I could do lots of things with this piece of paper. I could write on it, I could color, I could paint, I could scrunch it up and throw it away. I could throw it out to you in the audience. I could fold it up into a crane. I could do lots of things with it. So you could say in some ways, all of the possibilities that I could bring to bear are inherent in this piece of paper, right? They're enfolded. They're enfolded in this piece of paper. E-N-F-O-L-D-E-D, enfolded. And then if I folded it in a certain way, and I got this little thing, that's what I get, right? it would be explicit. I took all these possibilities and turned them into that paper plane. Okay? This is really important as we move on through this afternoon. So there's implicit and there's explicit. And the implicit is always more interesting than the explicit because it's the subtler. The explicit is just derived from the implicit. This is really important. And this came about through the physicist David Bohm in the 70s and 80s and the 60s, actually doing interesting experiments with ink blots where if you turn this machine and the ink blot shows, and you keep rotating that machine in a particular way, you watch the ink blot unravel and disappear. And then if you reverse the drum, it re-shows itself. So is it here or is it not here? Is an electron a wave or a particle? It's both, right? It's changing phases and states. It's phase changes all the time. And it's subtle. And it's important because what is explicit is derivative of the it comes out of the subtle. We usually think about it the other way. And this is going to become important as I continue. So in MBSR, just so you know, I think that there are lots of ways to talk about it. But one way to think about it is that, and this is not only for the students, but it's for the teacher as well. It is a kind of what the British psychiatrist D.H. Winnicott called a holding environment. And he was studying how mothers and babies bond, and what does a baby need in terms of an environment to sustain itself and grow into a thriving child. And in the 90s, a fellow named Robert Keegan, a professor at Harvard, took some of Winnicott's work and he elucidated it in more contemporary terms and made it easier to read it and understand it. And he described that a holding environment has three characteristics. One is that it confirms people where they are. It confirms people where they are. In other words, that's exactly what's happening in MBSR classroom. People are screened in, and largely our screening process is a pretty wide net for bringing people into the course and saying, we are absolutely willing to work with you just as you are. And not only that, but that you actually have enormous genius. Maybe you don't know it. Maybe I don't say it to people like that, but that there's something innate in people and incredibly capable. If you can find a way to do what the Irish poet William Butler Yeats said. He talked about education. He said, education is less like filling a pail and more like igniting a fire. And that's what good education is supposed to do. It's supposed to ignite people's interest, their desire, their curiosity to learn because they start asking questions. And I don't know how it is in Denmark, but I can tell you in America, we're much more interested in getting answers from our students than the questions. But the questions are what lead to the answers. The questions are what lead to the answers and what fuels somebody's curiosity and passion and interest because they're trying to solve a problem or they're trying to understand a new set of questions that they may never have asked themselves before. Like, am I my cancer? Is it actually possible for me to be more at ease in my life? Could I get out from underneath a lot of the habits and patterns that I've identified with as me for a very long time? That I think are me? What happens when I actually discover that I'm not my thoughts? And I don't mean just intellectually, but I mean directly. Well then, who the hell am I? Another good question, isn't it? What am I? That's what is interesting to people after a time. Are there good answers for that? No. They're only discoveries. So we take people where they are. If they're willing to roll up their sleeves and come into the stress reduction clinic and work hard for the next 8 weeks, we'll take you. You're okay. You've got all the apparatus necessary. That's what confirming is about. A good holding environment is also introduces a little contradiction, like in the context of MBSR. Is it true that you can't relax? Have you ever been relaxed? Have you actually ever done something that's different than the pattern that you say that you're stuck in? Who says they're not able to pay attention to their breathing? Who is that? Is that true? Those are contradictions in the usual state of who I think I am and what I'm all about. That's very useful for us. Have you noticed how contradiction helps us grow? The physicists would say we're introducing a little turbulence or perturbing the system a little bit, or some kind of disorienting dilemma is one of the terms now used these days. There are disorienting dilemmas that are occurring in our lives all the time. Like when you walk into the clinic and you say, you know, I'm just not right. Well, you know something about yourself. You're saying, I don't know how to describe it, but something's not quite right for me. And that's contradicting your particular or usual view of who you think you are. So contradiction is valuable. And the third quality in a holding environment, a good holding environment, is that it offers continuity. So you have something that can carry you for a while in your life. So in that mother-child bonding process, that could carry you through a lifetime. It will carry us through a lifetime, no matter how it's been, but one would want it to have a lot of continuity and connectedness. And so in many different ways, we're attempting to create an environment, a learning environment where continuity is there. One of the most direct ways to create that kind of continuity is, rather than give people a lot to read about for 8 weeks, they get a very big dose of experience. Experiential education is all about providing continuity, right? Because in the end, what can we rely on? Our experience. If they could rely on books to reduce their stress, to feel better, to learn to interact with their disease in a different way or their illnesses, then I wouldn't have to be in the classroom. I could just hand them a book. But it doesn't work that way, does it, for any of us? They're useful, but as Herman Melville said, true places are not on maps. And they're not in books, but you can discover them. We can discover them inside ourselves. And so experience winds up being tremendous continuity, because it means 8 weeks later, when you walk out of that room, if you know something about the meditation practice, if you know something new about yourself and how you want to be in your life, that would provide you some hopefully, some long, enduring, and resilient continuity. So all of those are about support. They're supportive. They're supportive. You know, they're kind of like, they're reminding people of something. But there's a whole nother side. This is also for the teacher. MBSR is also a crucible. You know what a crucible is? It's a container that you put something in. Take, for instance, gold. You could take the ore, the rock, the metal that gold is, put it into a crucible and melt it, heat it up and melt it, and turn that ore into gold. Refine it so it's pure. Okay? You do similar kinds of things if you're making rose oil or perfume, right? You would take thousands of roses, you'd heat them up in some particular way, you'd distill them in some particular way, so that in the end you get a 1-ounce bottle that contains 1,000 roses, because you've distilled it. And it's usually through heat and pressure that there's some kind of transformation that takes place. So a crucible is a vessel. It's a kind of holding place for that kind of work to be done. And isn't that what transforms us all the time? That kind of friction, that kind of heat, that kind of unexpectedness. Even in the business world now, they're talking about crucible moments. Moments when all that you think, all that you've done before, they don't hold anymore. And you go through some kind of transformation. So that crucible for both the teacher and the participants in an MBSR classroom is really about this. It's about dissolving who and what we think we are. Now, you never have to say this to somebody. It's too scary. But that's what begins to happen. And so if you're a teacher, you really have to be able to hold that, because you're doing this work on yourself continually. I don't mean just when you sit down for an hour and practice meditation. Because you're also guiding people into how am I going to be in relationship to myself and the people around me when the ideas about who I have been for the last 30 or 40 years start fragmenting or falling apart or disintegrating in some way, because they do. So when I first read that paper, the Rebecca Crane and William Kuyken's paper, many times, and I asked myself this question in the end. If I went into the classroom with all the competencies that they named, would it ensure that I would be a good MBSR teacher? That was a question I asked myself. And the answer was no, not in my mind. In my mind, those were important, but they were explicit. And my view was just the way this blank paper has enormous possibilities that could turn into a paper airplane or a paper crane or a crumbled piece of paper or a canvas for something. There's something implicit underneath all those explicit competencies. And that's what I was interested in asking about, is what was implicit? Because well, let's see, the Stress Reduction Clinic and MBSR is now 35 years old. This is our 35th anniversary. 20,000 patients have gone through our clinic. There are tens of thousands of people around the world engaging in MBSR courses all the time. And so I ask myself over and over again, what is it that in some way fuels my intention and my interest and my willingness to investigate my own experience and continue to enter that classroom? So I've tried to name 4 of them, and we'll talk about that a little bit today. But before I say any more, I'm going to read you a little poem. It was written in the 13th century by Rumi, poet Rumi. You know, Rumi's still one of the best-selling poets in the world today, 700 years later, largely due to the work of the American poet Coleman Barks, who's translated so much of his work, but not exclusively. There are other wonderful translators as well. And it's an interesting kind of metaphor that he's talking about here. And it's a conversation between a chickpea, you know what a chickpea is? Okay? And the cook, who's making some soup. A chickpea leaps almost over the rim of the pot where it is being boiled. Why are you doing this to me? The cook knocks him down with his ladle. Don't you try and jump out. You think I'm torturing you. I'm giving you flavor so you can mix with spices and rice and be the lovely vitality of a human being. Remember when you drank in the garden? That was for this. Grace first, sexual pleasure, then a boiling new life begins, and the friend has something good to eat. Eventually the chickpea will say to the cook, boil me some more. Hit me with the skimming spoon. I can't do this by myself. I can't do this by myself. I'm like an elephant that dreams of gardens back in Hindustan and doesn't pay attention to his driver. You are my cook. You're my cook, my driver, my way into existence. I love your cooking. The cook says, I was once like you, fresh from the ground. Then I boiled in time and boiled in the body, 2 fierce boilings. My animal soul grew powerful, controlled it. I controlled it with my practices and boiled some more, and once more beyond that, and became your teacher. And became your teacher. Isn't that a wonderful metaphor for the crucible and for this relationship between human beings? How much are we the teacher for one another all the time? How many times have you been popped back in the pot when you wanted to jump out? And maybe you got to the place where finally you realized being in the pot's not so bad. It's better than being the same old person I've always been, or always thought I was. It's intriguing, it's exciting, and it's interesting. And so this first implicit competency, there's probably 1,000 ways to say it, but it's kind of like what in the Hindu tradition is called Leela. It's this play that's taking place in our lives all the time. The real question is not that it's happening. How do we use it? And in service of what? So what are some of the stuff that's happening in our lives? Well, there's a lot of drama, have you noticed? And we can get caught up in it easily. And we can believe it's me. That's what happens with the chickpea, right? Why are you doing this to me? I don't deserve this. There's also this rending feeling we have often of being not quite connected. Or even in those moments when we feel connected, feeling like, when is this going to end? How am I going to guard against this? In some cases, this is like a primary wound for a lot of us. Maybe all of us, I think, this feeling that we're separate somehow. And we all want to belong. Maybe we're not separate at all. But maybe it has some value to us to feel it because it encourages us to go in a certain way, to move away from it towards what we like to think of as union, the sense of being connected, of being engaged. I can tell you this happens a lot in the classroom. People start saying in week 5 or 6, and there's weeks to go, what am I going to do when this ends? Because they've discovered some sense of what's it like to be in relationship to other human beings who've all of a sudden gotten really interested in their lives. Even if what drove them into that interest was something to do with medicine or healthcare, their own well-being, their own health. And of course, the feeling of suffering. We're suffering all the time. How do we begin to work with it? How do we begin to use it? What do we begin to discover about it between the kind of everyday suffering that you can't help it on one level, and then on another level there's the suffering we add on to it all the time. Which on one level creates way more suffering. It's what in psychology used to call the double knot. You have some kind of suffering or worry or anxiety about X, and then you worry about your anxiety about that thing. You wonder what's going to happen tomorrow. Change is not easy for us, but have you noticed it's one of the only constants in our lives? It's all changing, it's all changing, it's all changing. And if you don't have to believe me, but look closely at your life and you'll see there's probably some subtle and not so subtle ways where you're trying to hold it back. From the body on up, no amount of plastic surgery is going to hold it back. Doesn't mean no amount of push-ups is going to hold something back. Still worth doing, but maybe to keep healthy, but not necessarily to hold something back. It's inevitable. Change happens. And you know what? We always think of the downside of it. How about the upside of it? Aren't there a lot of things you're glad that changed in the last 10 years in your life? Aren't there things you're really happy you don't have now that you had then? People, relationships, situations, changing all the time. Isn't it lovely to see your children go from 3 to 13, or 23 or 33? It only happens because of change. But it's hard for us. Because people say all the time in the stress reduction clinic, I want to be the way I used to be. That means I don't want to change. Guess what? That's futile. Not going to happen. And there may be something better. Isn't that exactly what the chickpea is saying? Until he finally comes around and says, boil me some more. He says it. The cook doesn't say it. He says it. Let's see what I'll become. And we have all kinds of thoughts, and we think that they're ours. Right? If it passed between these two ears, guess what? It's true. In America we have a great philosopher, Mark Twain, and he once said, he's dead now, he's been dead a long time, like the rest of us will be, but he said something really interesting. He said, my life has been filled with tragedies, most of which never occurred. And what he's pointing at is that whole business of, wow, thoughts are pretty powerful. And they drive us all the time. Now, they're beautiful as well. So this isn't a condemnation of thinking, but it's to say we get caught up pretty quickly, don't we? And we're convinced they're ours. And of course, one of the great discoveries from MBCT, or mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, was the discovery, well, not just from there, but that rumination itself, that endless loop of thinking in particular grooves, is actually what drives depression and anxiety. So if you can teach people to step out of the groove, then they may actually gain a new kind of perspective and a new kind of traction in their lives and on their predicaments. And of course, emotions are the same way. They're wonderful. And they also can drive us. and fool us into thinking that they all are equal in substantiality and in their veracity, in their truthfulness. And that we have a self. I'm a noun. Has a history, of course it does. It has a unique package, of course it does. There's no denying that. I'm not going to deny that. We all have a self, if you will, sense of self, kind of a navigational chart. That's as good as it probably gets. But we all of a sudden say, this is who I am. This is how I've been all my life, and I'm going to stay that way. And that's trouble. I did a research study years ago with patients in our clinic, and one of the things they said was they started to feel more like verbs than nouns. That's an interesting way of describing. And, you know, we love nouns because they fix things, they identify them. They have their value. Absolutely. They're also limiting because they're fixed. So where's the fluidity in this something we call the self? Because trying to hold on to it as well is like staying in a box, staying in a prison. Why shouldn't it change and be fluid just like everything else? Don't we know now that even on the biological side, the brain is incredibly fluid? We used to think it wasn't. But it's an organ of experience. It actually changes because of experience. It's continually adapting. It's malleable. It's shapeable. Why should we, in quotes, who we call a self, be any different? And then there's this little sticky thing called nowness. Have you noticed? It's always now. There's always a choice to be made now. There's always the decisions to be made now. It's always now. It's always right here. What shall I do now? How shall I approach this situation now? Is what I did yesterday of value today? It might be in this situation if it's similar, but it may not be. So how do I approach it now? How do I rely more on this sense of being flexible? So I've been asking myself this for a long time. Since I have all these experiences just like you do, how do I use them in service of waking up? Not to deny them, not to pretend they don't exist, not to think that my job is to get rid of all of them, but how do I use them as an MBSR teacher to wake up? And as a human being, before an MBSR teacher, to wake up. And then there's this second competency, this implicit competency that I call soul work. The depth psychologists call it soul work. And they talk about going down. They talk about us beginning to explore what we're not used to exploring. The Spanish poet Antonio Machado wrote a beautiful, or frighteningly beautiful, 4-line poem. Man owns 4 things that are no good at sea: anchor, oar, rudder, and the fear of going down. The fear of going down. And in this soul work, depth psychologists talk about going down. They talk about us entering more deeply into our own experience, into our own lives in very particular ways that are not necessarily pleasant, but they may be transformative. And a lot of the sort of mythology and the myths, especially in what are called middle and elder tales, middle tales in particular, rather than fairy tales. Fairy tales are all about conquest and heroines and heroes, and they look a particular way, they smell a particular way, they do things in a particular way. It's almost like you're immortal when you're 18 or 19 or 20 or 17, and all of those, what we call fairy tales, talk about that. But there's a whole body of tales called middle tales and elder tales, and the middle tales are all about this going down. You know, like Cinderella, she has to sweep the ashes for 7 years. That's going down. She looks lousy. She doesn't wash her hair very much. People make fun of her. Nobody pays attention to her. She has a kind of labor that takes place continually. We're going through this in our lives all the time. How do we use it? We're exploring failure. And we're experiencing a certain kind of death of who we think we are. Over and over again. If you read those middle tales, that's what's happening over and over again. That we're sort of in the crucible. Think about the middle of your life. Children, mortgages, jobs. There's a certain grinding quality to it. A certain relentlessness to it. It isn't all sweet. We get to see the underbelly of situations all the time. But in that process, if we're willing to work with it, we're actually creating gold out of dust. We're creating compost out of garbage or out of what we think is waste. Isn't this the way the earth is renewed all the time? This is the way the planet works. We start to have to face in some real ways the unwanted, the undesirable, what we find repulsive. And so we have a little instruction about this from Rumi. Don't turn your head. Keep looking at the bandaged place. That's where the light enters you. And of course, in our contemporary times, Leonard Cohen has written a song that kind of catches the theme of this. This was written 700 years ago. Don't turn your head. Keep looking at the bandaged place. That's where the light enters you. And so in this great work that occurs in this going down or this soul work, we're actually beginning to look at what we call our wounds, or the places we'd rather turn away from, the places we'd rather segment and cut ourselves off from, all in service of discovering our wholeness, our connectedness. That's what's happening to the chickpea, isn't it? It's discovering its wholeness, even as it boils, even as it dissolves a little, begins to mingle with the spices and the rice to create vitality. So I think an NBSR teacher has to be committed to this kind of continual looking, seeing, not in some kind of punishing way, but because it's useful and it's interesting. And this is what you're going to encounter in that classroom. Because in some very real way, the work breaks us open. How fortunate we would be if it does break us open. Because in the end, no matter what your occupation, I mean, if you're helping other people, isn't the job to join? It's to connect. And to do that, we have to be broken open. We have to be broken, not broken, broken open. You know, it's an old Carly Simon song, don't cry if I fall apart, there's more room in a broken heart. It's true. It's true. We're afraid of it, but it's true. It's vast. There's something we call the heart, and our capacity to carry and hold and be in relationship with people. There's an intensity to it. And because there's enormous vulnerability, we start to discover that there's a kind of rawness about life, a kind of tenderness about life, that we stop flinching away from so much of the time, and we allow ourselves to melt, to soften. Just think what it's like in your country when spring comes and the rivers start to break up, the ice starts to melt, the water bugs start to show up. the sounds arise. The plants begin to grow along the edges. This is what happens to us as human beings. We start to melt. And when we melt, we become more capable of meeting others because we're not so fixed, we're not so caught. And then there's something called love, and we talk a lot about it, but what is it actually? We all know what it is, but we all know it slightly differently, and that's part of the beauty of it. What do you love? What do you love? These are critically important questions to ask oneself. What do you love? What do you know about it? So these are implicit competencies. At least I see it that way. And it's only these implicit competencies that allow us to turn towards what we don't want to turn towards. Because we have some kind of an inherent commitment to it. Not because we're supposed to, but because we want to. Because there's something so alive in our willingness to no longer turn away, but to realize I can meet this situation. I may not like it. It's not at all pleasant. I don't have to pretend it is, but I have the capacity to meet it. What a powerful message for us as human beings. And it's discovered all the time in the MBSR classroom, not just by saying it to people, by help, but by, in some way, being in a kind of coaching situation almost with people where they begin to discover they can turn towards. They can do something that seems completely out of the usual, because it is. We usually run from what we don't want, we usually deny it, or we fight with it. Well, those options don't do much, do they? For very long. So there's this whole other option, which is, wow, I could meet it. I could learn something about falling. When I was a boy, I lived in Japan, and for 2 years I studied jiu-jitsu. The first year, the only thing I learned was how to fall. That's all that happened. Every time I went to the dojo, the guy threw me over his shoulder or his hip. And then one day he said to me, now you do me. I was 9 years old. There's a big lesson in learning how to fall, because it teaches us a lot about intimacy. We learn about standing inside of situations in new ways and not necessarily making a decision hastily or running from it, but discovering I can hold the tension of standing inside the not yet known. And so can you. If you're in my classroom, you can learn that. You can learn something about, because I can learn about surrendering to what is. Do you ever have those situations when every move is the wrong move? You know that well. We all know that well. When you just, everything you do is not the right thing to do. We have to rely on something else in those moments, something about our being, our capacity. That's what's happening to the chickpea. He's allowing himself to surrender. And you feel tender and raw and alive. And you know it. Because you're willing to hold the world in your own heart. You're willing to sever the separation. You start to discover just how big you actually are. You're big. That's what transcendence is all about. It means seeing your bigness. Little by little, we become intimate with it. And then these competencies begin to make some sense, at least to me. Knowledge of the curriculum, relational skills, guiding the practices, conveying teaching themes, holding the container. Because there are two kinds of intelligence, as Rumi says. One that's acquired. Those competencies are acquired. That's how we learn skills. We acquire them. We get better at them. We practice them. And certainly part of our work with teachers in formation in Oasis Institute is you learn these things. You practice them over and over again. You have experience with them. You build a certain kind of muscle but it's coming out of something else. It's coming out of the other intelligence that Rumi says, the other one that's already complete inside of you. It's already complete inside of you. That's the implicit. And the acquired comes out of that capacity. And that's what I think leads to this something called embodiment. Because it's a lifetime's, I don't know if work's the right word. Sometimes it feels like work. Sometimes it feels like journey. Sometimes it feels like odyssey. Sometimes it feels like adventure. So that's the end of my presentation. And I hope that you find it useful.